on Marxism and Socialism. I think I must have first encountered Karl Marx and his theories in any serious way as an undergraduate when I did a political theory paper, and towards the end we got to Marx and I read something about him. And like many young people, I was, 20 or so, I was very attracted to this utopian vision of how all the ills around me could be addressed by a radical solution of abolishing this and abolishing that and giving power back and creating equality and peace and harmony. And so I really was a fan of Marx. In fact, I remember, although I never went to a meeting, I joined the Oxford University Communist Club. It wasn't a party, but it was a club, but I never went to a meeting. And I was, I suppose, at that time really a socialist. My mother was a socialist, and I followed suit, and I greatly admired left-wing people like R.H. Tawney and my teacher Christopher Hill and others for standing up for the ordinary working people against the arrogance and unfairness of the world. And this interest in socialism and a sort of vague interest in Marxism continued for some years. I never became a serious Marxist. For example, there was a wave of Marxism in history at that time, and a number of the historians took a very Marxist interpretation. Many of the board of Past and Present, the leading historical journal, like R.H. Hilton and Christopher Hill and Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson, were all labelled as Marxists. Though now, looking back on them, I realise they weren't Marxists in the strong sense of the meaning in Russia or even in a certain period in China. They were British socialists. That is, they were pragmatic. They believed in evolution rather than bloody revolution, and they believed that we should try and aim for a more just and fair society. So when the wave of Marxism came into anthropology, which was in the 1960s, particularly from France, and particularly around the time I was converting into anthropology at the London School of Economics, the time of the student uprisings and the rest of it, and Marxism was the new thing along with structuralism in anthropology. I read some of this, but it wasn't entirely convincing. It went against a central principle of anthropology, which is that there is no determining infrastructure, which is the essence of Marxism. That economics, of course, is important, but when you look at different societies around the world, you find that equally important are things like social organization and religion and particularly politics. So one thing doesn't determine everything else, and indeed, if anything is the determinant in the majority of human history and society, it's the family, social relations rather than economic relations. In other words, the great lesson was that economy is embedded within a whole, which consists of power and belief and social relations as well as economic. So I never went very far with that kind of interpretation. And what has happened later in my life, as I've reflected further, and as I've learned more, as we all have, about what Marxism looks like when it is in command, as it were, when we learned more about Russia or the Soviet Union, and we learnt about the ghastly gulags and rule of Stalin, then most British Marxists like Christopher Hill and others renounced their membership of the party after that, and after the invasion of Hungary and so on. Many British Marxists who had been idealists and radicals in the 30s. They saw, as Gerstler put it in his book of essays by others, that the God had failed, or the God that failed, and it wasn't a solution. The Soviet Union was one example. Later, there was the terrible example of Cambodia and Pol Pot, and as the facts emerged in the 90s of the purges and horrors of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward in China in the middle of the century, it became evident to any really thinking person that Marxism might be very attractive, it might be idealistic. Marx himself might not in that fact be a Marxist, but when put into trial, the test of the pudding was some of the worst purges and destructions of life and undermining of societies of the 20th century, perhaps equal to fascism. So an extreme form, an extreme opposite in some ways of fascism, was as bad as fascism. And so recently I've come to re-examine Marx's views, and having admired them and read quite a lot of them, I began to question them, almost all of them, and to see that he was in many ways blinded by his anger, blinded by his Old Testament prophetic desire to sweep away everything, and his resort to things like anthropology and even history were terribly pick here and miss out there. They took bits and really didn't basically understand either of those disciplines, particularly anthropology, and the idea that the nature of man was basically good and peaceful and loving in very early societies, and the rest of history had been a decline to where we are now, was ridiculous. He grossly underestimated the aggression and competitiveness of human beings, and thought that if you could brush away all the things that had been built up painfully and gradually through civilizations like private property, the legal system, the political system, the religious system, if you just took all that out and went back to being a herd of animals or hunter-gatherers, then everything would be fine. Well, of course it wasn't. When you created that vacuum, other, even more unpleasant or equally unpleasant things came in. And as Orwell put it, all men were certainly said to be equal, but some certainly were more equal than others. So Orwell's vision in Animal Farm and so on worked out. It was a disastrous experiment, and those who call for it now have to look, as others have to look, at what actually happened in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, and see, is that what they want? And so I've been increasingly critical. I still see Marx as a towering figure, of course, but he doesn't have solutions really to the iniquities I see around him. And the last point to make is really why his message, though he worked in England much of his life, and he preached in English as well as German, why his message never really took off in England, whereas it did in many parts of the continent, and even, as I say, in anthropology it was in France and elsewhere that Marxist anthropology developed. And I think this is to do with the long English tradition of middle-of-the-roadism, disliking extremism of all kinds, and a long tradition of change through evolution rather than dramatic revolutionary shifts. And these two things together meant that even the most extreme British Marxists were, by continental standards, very pale and socialist. And so socialism has been very important in English history, the Labour Party, founding of the LSE and so on. But in terms of setting up a revolutionary agenda for the English people, it's never got beyond a pretty pale, mild British form of socialism. And I'm not unhappy with that, because I think, although it is also unsatisfactory, it's less unsatisfactory than the blood and gore and sweep it all away and start again brigade of true dyed-in-the-wool Marxists.